Hi guys, today I'm doing my October wrap-up. October was an okay reading month, I would say. I read some books that I actually enjoyed, yay, but none that really wowed me. And it's been the same for the whole of 2021. I read a lot of duds, some books that I really enjoyed, but very, very few that I thought were amazing, that actually offered something new to me and felt fresh and original. I hope I can still turn the trend around in the remaining 6.5 weeks of the year. I've made some plans. I've resolved to actually pick up books that I've been meaning to read for a long time, instead of shiny new ones that seem like easier entertainment. Because at the end of the day, I'm getting sick of this literary, intellectual fast food and need something of real substance for a change. But anyway, October. So I actually read a book in October that qualifies for Victober. I'm not usually big on Victorian classics because I think there comes a point in your life when Victorian classics stop to offer you anything new. And so the one that I picked was just mindless entertainment. It's an adventure novel called The Prisoner of Zenda by Anthony Hope. I think this is a pretty famous one that seems to be still widely read, but I don't come across it often on BookTube, if at all. So this is the story of Lord Rudolph Rossendale, who is bored of doing nothing at home in England and therefore goes on a holiday to the fictional Central European kingdom of Ruritania, where he is distantly and unofficially related to the ruling family. And when he arrives in Ruritania, he instantly gets caught up in a fight for the throne of the kingdom. The heir apparent of the late king is being threatened and challenged by a relative who is trying to usurp. And since Rudolph Rossendale is the spitting image of the prince, he gets caught up in this pretty deeply. It is extremely funny and entertaining, but also, to be honest, kind of appalling in a way. The author, Anthony Hope, is a peer himself, and you can kind of tell from the fact that nowhere in the whole story any consideration whatsoever is given by the narrator, Rudolph Rossendale, that there is an actual country to be ruled here and that the king of Ruritania is at least nominally responsible for the country and the people who live there. There is one scene towards the beginning of the book where the poverty and squalor in the city are described, and it is mentioned that the poorer parts of the population, or even the population in general, actually side with the usurper and think of him as their champion. And then that is simply never mentioned again. The people of the country simply do not exist for the purpose of this story. And that is very telling, I think. This is kind of the opposite of Dickens. It's a cute story, but completely frivolous and irrelevant. And then I read a German book. I've been doing quite well on the German front this year. And in October I read an absolute classic, Der Tod in Venedig, Death in Venice by Thomas Mann. This is the portrait of an artist, a writer, who has tragically succeeded in taming his wild artistic soul through rigid self-discipline into something that is acceptable for his own bourgeois upper middle class upbringing and for the sensibilities of his upper middle class audience. And it is the story of how it all comes crashing down once he drops one of the reins. The first fissures begin to appear in the carefully constructed house of cards that is his personality, when he sees a young man on the street one day. He seems to be a migrant worker. He seems to have a sunny disposition and a straw hat. And it stirs in the writer a feeling of restlessness and some undefined yearning for freedom. And he interprets it literally and goes off on a holiday to Italy like an E.M. Forrester heroine. And there in Venice, the whole house of cards comes crumbling down for good and very thoroughly. And this is an extremely interesting concept. However, it is executed in the most unappealing fashion imaginable. And I know what we have here is a marriage of form and content. The thing is just as stiff and joyless as its protagonist. But the thing is, I wouldn't want to read his books either. But the absolute worst thing about this is how incredibly heavy-handed Mann is with his Plato, and to a lesser degree also with his Nietzsche. It's really almost distastefully heavy-handed. To sum it up, there is a reason why almost nobody in Germany, Austria, Switzerland reads Thomas Mann nowadays if they can avoid it. And now for something completely different, but again another shorty, Nocturno de Chile by Roberto Bolaño. I think this has been translated under the title By Night in Chile. This is the rambling life story of a dying priest who is prompted to tell his life story by a mysterious somebody whom he calls the aged youth, who is a figment of his imagination and acts as a sort of personified conscience, or maybe externalized conscience. And he or it challenges him, and he tells his life story as a confession, but one by which he means to demonstrate that he has always been beyond reproach. But of course, in doing so, in the process, he ends up demonstrating the complete opposite. This is a bitingly sarcastic indictment of the cultural elite in Chile, who all through the 20th century have been woefully out of touch with reality and willfully out of touch, and have done the ostrich approach with everything that didn't immediately concern them, and not much concerned them because they were not only the cultural but also the socio-economic elite. So they have been able to live life in a very pleasant, self-absorbed fashion and have refused to engage with reality, and therefore, of course, their art also doesn't engage with reality. I really enjoyed this. I'm sure it would have been even funnier and more meaningful to me if I were from the actual cultural context. I'm sure there were a lot of references in this that went straight over my head. The only thing that surprised me a little was that the writing style doesn't seem to be completely in keeping with the kind of narration that we have in here. I would have expected its language to be a lot more rambling, because after all, what we have here is a rambling old man on his deathbed. But the language was actually pretty clear. I mean, yes, we have a lot of run-on sentences in here, long run-on sentences in here. But like most run-on sentences, they are, for the most part, fake run-on sentences, because a lot of the time with run-on sentences, you can put a period where a comma is and it won't change the meaning at all, but you suddenly have two sentences that are a lot easier to read. So the rambling is a kind of fake rambling, because otherwise the language is pretty clear. There are very few fragmentary sentences, if any at all, and it is told in a very associative fashion, but only insofar as it jumps from story to story in an associative fashion, but not from sentence to sentence. The sentences always follow logically one from another. So in a way, that was a little bit disappointing, but not overly much. And I'm definitely going to read more Bolaño in the future. And yet another novella, Box Hill by Adam Mars Jones. I got curious about this because I read a Guardian article about the Booker Prize, and apparently this was nominated for the 2020 Booker by the publisher, but got pushed off the list because it was altogether too gay. And of course, the 2020 winner was Shuggie Bain, and that one was gay enough, but not too gay for the jury's taste. So of course I had to immediately go and buy this. This is endearingly subtitled A Story of Low Self-Esteem, and that's exactly what it is. It's the story of a young man told by his middle-aged self, a young man who is extremely shy due to body image issues, and the shyness has also made him quite indecisive and lethargic. And on his 18th birthday, he literally stumbles across a sexy biker and immediately enters into a kind of dom-sub relationship with him. Only it isn't really. It's like a grotesque caricature of a dom-sub relationship in which we, from an external point of view, would say that the submissive part is horribly exploited. The biker's behavior would be described by most of us as abuse, only the narrator doesn't think of it as abuse and doesn't describe it as such. There are just a couple of instances where maybe you think that he might be more damaged than he knows or lets on by this past relationship. But most of the time, he describes it as the best time of his life. And I don't really know what to do with this book. I think it kind of raises the question of whether or not abuse is abuse if the supposedly abused party doesn't think of it and doesn't perceive it as abuse. And I think we would all do well to remember that relationships have different dynamics, and relationships are different because the people in it are different. So something that would be problematic for you doesn't necessarily have to be problematic for everyone. You see a lot of reviews of romance novels on Goodreads, for example, where readers complain horribly that a given book doesn't really have a happy ending because the relationship that develops is not an acceptable relationship, because it wouldn't be acceptable for them. And they fail to see that for other people, behavior that would be problematic for them and would result in an unequal relationship in their case is maybe completely okay in a relationship that is composed of two different people. So in that way, this book serves as a good reminder. However, on the other hand, there are some things, some behaviors that do seem to be universally damaging, even if the receiving party isn't maybe completely aware of the damaging effects. And the question is, do we really want to blur that line even further, the line between abuse and acceptable behavior? I've watched an interview with the author, and he seems to be of the opinion that what he is doing in this book is oh so edgy and clever. Yet in reality, isn't this the least edgy thing you could possibly do? Because this line gets blurred in reality 100 million times every day all over the world. It's the least edgy thing to do, really. It's a very old white male thing to do. And also, this is such an exaggerated caricature of a dom-sub relationship that I think 1/3 of the audience will be completely scandalized by what it thinks is a realistic rendition of such a relationship. And maybe another third will also think that it is realistic and will end up romanticizing this. So this leaves me all the more with the question, what do you actually want to do here, and are you sure that you really want to do it? Okay, time to breathe. The rest of my October reads was all genre fiction that was written and read for entertainment mostly. Another gay one, Goldenboy by Michael Nava. This is the second in the original Henry Rios mystery series. Henry Rios is a gay Latin American defense attorney from California. He sometimes works from San Francisco and sometimes from LA. And the series follows the cases and the social issues that he comes into contact with during his work. So this is, Michael Nava has been rewriting the series, and this is the original, not yet rewritten second book in the series. And having read this, I can totally see why Michael Nava has been rewriting these books, because this is extremely uneven and awkward, and I wouldn't recommend that you pick this up if you aren't already familiar with the new, reworked and extremely well written and accomplished Henry Rios mysteries. Yeah, this just as a warning. And then Gentlemen and Players by Joanne. She is the author of Chocolat, which I haven't read, but I love the movie. And this is set at a traditional English grammar school. It was written in the early 2000s. And in that school, we follow a classics teacher who is close to retirement age and who is fighting against his own descent into irrelevance and fighting the rise and takeover of the modern language teachers. And the whole school is under a secret attack from somebody who isn't quite an alumnus, but nevertheless has a long, painful history with the school, and who has vowed to bring the school down and has a very thorough plan. This is extremely funny in an understated English way, extremely sarcastic. The one huge problem that I had with this story is that its success kind of hinges on a great mystery that is revealed at the end of the story. And unfortunately, I thought it was blatantly obvious, and I knew what it was at about page 100, if not earlier. And it was a little bit ridiculous watching the author place red herrings everywhere and thinking that she was leading me astray as the reader, when all the while I knew exactly what she was doing. And also towards the end, it takes a turn into what I think is a little bit cheap thriller territory, because a psychopathy element enters the story that wasn't always there, or at least the reader wasn't aware that it was there, and it's a bit over dramatic, I would say. So in the end, that left me a little bit disappointed, but it was nevertheless a very amusing read. And maybe if you don't figure out the secret prematurely, the ending will probably be quite jaw-dropping. I don't know. So, not sure if I would recommend this or not, to be honest. And my next book is one of my disappointments of the year, because the book is one of my most anticipated ones of the year. It's Summer Suns by Mandelo from Tor.com Publishing. This is a horror story. The protagonist, Andrew, has just lost his best friend and adoptive brother. The two of them used to be attached by the hip all through school and college, until one day, out of the blue, Eddie accepted an early admission into Vanderbilt University for a master's program. And before Andrew could join him the next semester, Eddie killed himself. Or so everybody thinks. Andrew, on the other hand, is quite convinced that Eddie didn't take his own life. And he has a suspicion that maybe his death is something to do with the fact that both of them could see and feel revenants, so zombies, but in a non-corporeal form. They are like imprints of dead persons, but their touch can nevertheless have repercussions in the physical realm. And against everybody's wishes, Andrew goes ahead with a plan to study at Vanderbilt and moves into the house that he inherited from the super rich Eddie. And he also inherits a housemaid together with the house, who introduces him to the crowd that Eddie used to hang out with, who are all of the irresponsible rich kid kind. And then there's also Eddie's master's project, which Andrew inherits as well. This sounds like a super interesting, fun, dark campus novel. But it's not. It's super frustrating and there's hardly any campus in it. The protagonist acts in a way that, at the end of the day, makes him not a good protagonist. He doesn't do anything, he just mopes around. And at the beginning, that is psychologically plausible, because he is in a very difficult and vulnerable situation, and he is surrounded everywhere by people who were intimate with his best friend / brother at the end of his life. So who were in a position that Andrew previously occupied, so he is jealous of them. But as time progresses, it becomes less and less plausible that he keeps moping around and doesn't take the initiative to find out what happened, which is why he went to Tennessee in the first place. And he keeps refraining to engage with both Eddie's and now his own social circle and the research side on campus. He finally begins to seriously look into this only at the 70% mark. And then his social life abruptly becomes so ridiculous that I decided to DNF the book at around the 80% mark. But I was already quite fed up with everything long before that. So the story may be thin and almost non-existent, but everything else is over the top. It's all just car races and drugs from morning till end, and all these 20-year-olds doing coke for breakfast and then streetcar racing for second breakfast, lunch, dinner and dessert. And everybody is bisexual and in a polyamorous relationship, even though we are not in the scene. Quite on the contrary, the social circle that we are in is quite homophobic, really. And then there's the thing that, I don't know about the car racing stuff, but the drug stuff, the way that it is talked about sounds like the author has never even seen anybody smoke weed and has only ever read about drug use in one of those pamphlets that, I don't know, the Jehovah's Witnesses put out or so. It's like, you know what it's like? It's like when old people write teenage slang, that's what it reminded me of. I couldn't take this book seriously at all. I was quite relieved when at the 80% mark it got so ridiculous that I could say, no, I'm done with this, goodbye. But I also read a really good fantasy book in October to end on a positive note. In Other Lands by Rees Brannon. This is an extremely cute, very entertaining portal fantasy / boarding school novel, and it only really exists in the context of other portal fantasies and boarding school stories, and to a degree, chosen one stories. Because next to no time and energy is given to world building in here. And I don't mean that as a deficit, because we all know those stories. So not a lot of time has to be devoted to world building, and it can all go into character development. This is not the best fantasy book ever written, or even the best one that I read this year. It does have some pacing issues, and there's this thing happening that you can sometimes watch happen in TV series, where a character that wasn't originally supposed to be a real character, but only really a type, suddenly gets developed, and you are suddenly expected to take them seriously as a character. The same thing happens in this book towards the end. But on the whole, it is amazing. It's extremely fast-paced. We are following the adventures of a boy who enters the Other Lands by mistake and then gets invited to boarding school there. And this one book contains all his adventures of 5 years in boarding school in the Other Lands. And the best thing about this book is the snarky character voice that the author is able to keep up all through the book, and it never becomes grating, because the protagonist is a very intelligent boy or young man, and he often has reason to be snarky because he uncovers some pretty bad things and secrets in the Other Lands. It's not all fun and games, though, because there is also really some real heartbreak going on here. Because a lot of the character's snarkiness is a deflective shield that he hides behind because of his personal insecurities, because he has never really experienced love and acceptance in his home world. So he pushes people away from him in order to protect himself from disappointment and heartbreak. And that way, of course, ends up generating it in the first place. So the scenes where this issue is in the focus of the attention are extremely heartbreaking. And I think I cried a tear or two over this book. Absolutely lovely reading experience. Would recommend this to anybody who is looking for some just really nice, sweet fantasy to read. So those were the books that I read in October, and I'm afraid I don't have time to film an outro because my battery is dying. So, but do tell me if you've read any of these books, what you thought about them, what you thought about my thoughts about them, and what you've been reading in October. I'll see you very soon. Bye, guys.